It's my honor and privilege to introduce Dave Stevens, who's been a pillar in our industry for a long time. David Stevens is the CEO of Mountain Lake Consulting. Dave is a 40-year veteran of the mortgage banking industry. Dave previously served as the president and CEO of the Mortgage Bankers Association. And prior to that role, Dave served as the U.S. Assistant Secretary of Housing and Federal Housing Commissioner at U.S. Department of HUD. Dave has served a variety of key industry leadership roles prior to his work in Washington, including President and Chief Operating Officer of Long and Foster Real Estate, Executive Vice President of Wholesale Lending at Wells Fargo, and Senior Vice President in charge of single family lending at Freddie Mac, also a Group Senior Vice President at World Savings Bank. Dave currently sits on the board of Real Estate Investment Trust, Dynex Inc., in addition to his wonderful work with Mountain Lake Consulting. He's a very busy man. Dave works on advisory projects in real estate finance and providing technical and strategic consultation to financial institutions and their intermediaries. In 2018, Dave was named Mortgage Professional of the Year by National Mortgage Professional Magazine, has been named one of Bloomberg's 50 most powerful people in real estate and Inman's 100 top most influential leaders. He received the Founders Award from NAHREP in 2013, and Dave is often cited in media. He's been appearing on CNBC, PBS. We've all seen him on Bloomberg. He's been quoted multiple times in major media outlets. He has also testified before the U.S. Senate and House of Representatives multiple times and continues to influence policymakers in Washington. Dave received his CMB in 2015 and holds a BA in political science from the University of Colorado at Boulder. Many of us have met Dave along the way. You've been at every MBA conference I think I've ever been at, and wonderful to see you today. Thank you for taking the time. You did this for us earlier this year. Tremendous feedback. A lot of people who couldn't make it asked about it multiple times. We asked you if you would kindly update it, do it again, and you graciously agreed. So welcome, and we appreciate it.
Great, Jim. Great to be with you. Hey, everybody. So guys, what I'm going to do is, let me share my screen. So guys, I want to walk through a little bit about what we're seeing right now in the marketplace. I'm going to walk you through how market makers feel about the market right now. Everything I'm showing you until the final slide is just data. So I'm going to show you data that's been provided to me by either the Federal Reserve Board, the economist Mark Zandi, who's the chief economist at Moody's Analytics. In fact, he just gave a presentation to the FDIC day before yesterday, and he sent me his deck before he gave it, so I'm going to pull aside from that. Mike Fratantoni, the chief economist from the MBA, and other sources that are really significant in our environment. But I want to start with yesterday, right? So yesterday we had a wild ride in the markets. 10-year blew its way over 4%, and it all came from this downgrade. And this is from the Wall Street Journal this morning, the article on the right, but all I just want to emphasize to you is what's causing all this volatility right now is the downgrade created emotion. The emotion resulted in a sell-off that increased supply in all the trading windows that traders were looking at yesterday. That depressed prices and increased yields. But I was literally talking to the chief economist from the Mortgage Bankers Association this morning, Mike Fratantoni, and if I can find his statement to me, I said, what do you expect to happen from this? He goes, not a big change. We'll gauge the market reaction over the next couple of weeks, but this isn't going to be changing much. He said, my only advice would be not to lock today. He said this to me a couple hours ago. Now, I don't know we're having actually a better market day than I actually thought we would. But what I want you to do is get your heads out of the present, what's gone on the last couple of days. All of this volatility is correlated with the insecurities around things like a budget in Washington and political dysfunction, along with what the Fed is going to do. But I want you to focus on the long term, not the short term, because the long term is what you make your career out of. And that's the picture I'm going to talk to you about today. And I'm going to start with this picture. I showed it the last time I talked to the TPO group for Union Home, but it's data, right? This is from the Survey of Consumer Finances, a slide, but it's Census Bureau data from the Population Division. And all it looks at is the distribution of all Americans in the United States. This is June of 2020, so everybody in here is roughly 2 to 3 years older. but it's the Census Bureau data distribution of the entire population of the US from newborns all the way up to the aged in our country. And each line, which we would call a cohort, as you can see along the horizontal line at the bottom, are the ages. What this research team did that put this chart together, they created this headline as part of their presentation. And by the way, this was the Public Policy Institute in Washington, which is a renowned think tank, and they gave this presentation at a large event in DC that I attended. But their headline, as part of a long discussion about the economy as it relates to the housing market, headlines, millions of potential home buyers will age into their prime home buying age in coming years. And then it shows population estimates by age. And they highlighted these yellow bars for a reason. On the right side, it says median age for first-time home buyers. That's the call out. Median age for first-time home buyers is age 34. Now let's start with that as a base, because that's not guesswork by the Public Policy Institute. Believe it or not, the Federal Reserve Board of New York, the New York Fed, has a great research team. And every month for the last 20 years, I receive it in an email. One of the data items they publish in their monthly summary is the median age for first-time home buyers. They pull it from IRS records, but in the end of the day, it's completely accurate because all of these people are filing as homeowners. And if you look at the median age for first-time home buyers at age 34, by the way, about 10 years older than it was for the baby boom generation. But if you look to the left of everybody younger than age 34, now those guys today are 37, but nevertheless, 36, 35, 34, 33, 32, 31, 30, 29, 28, 27, even where they showed 26-year-olds, which is 29-year-olds, but even going into the blue bars past the orange bars, we are in for 6 to 7 years of greater demand rolling into their peak first-time year for home ownership coming at us from where we are today. The other thing I want to highlight for you is look at the whole population. This isn't just like, oh, we've seen this before kind of thing. We haven't. We had the baby boom generation, which is the little bubble out to the far right in their 50s and 60s. That was the biggest generation in America prior to the millennials. And when they came into their peak home buying years in the early 1980s, that was the biggest wave of home ownership demand the nation had ever seen. But it's much smaller than this one. This wave, this concentration of incoming home buying demand is without question the biggest wave of demand ever seen in the history of in the history of this country. And I start with this slide because everything I'm going to talk about related to supply of real estate, demand, forecast for interest rates, and then the ultimate summary of what does that all mean for volume, et cetera, is all data driven. And this is a core fundamental. Remember, basic economics. If you ever took microeconomics in college, the first theorem you learned was supply and demand. It's so basic. This is the demand part of that economic theorem that says when demand's high, depending on supply, it can have a significant impact on prices of what supply is available in any sector in the economy. You guys, right now, even though you're not feeling it because we've had a really hard 20 months here. We had a little I guess we had enough volume to get us through the spring to help us feel not completely terrible. But after 20 and 21, it's been difficult to recover. But we still aren't right-sized as an industry. We still have too many lenders. I could talk anecdotally about that if you're interested at the end, because I'm involved in a lot of transactions, company sales, which is fast and furious right now. But I will just tell you, as we right-size, and I believe we'll be fully right-sized by the end of Q1 next year, that will bring margins back to the business. And you'll be sitting, and the Fed will have stopped quantitative tightening. The Fed will actually likely be cutting rates next year, once, maybe twice. I'll show you that view from a couple of economists in just a moment. And so at the end of the day, what you're sitting in at right now is the tail end of a difficult period where the Fed was slowing the economy, because it was hyperinflated. And it was hyperinflated for a variety of reasons, and I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole right now. But you have nothing but better years ahead. And in fact, as I'm going to show you in a moment, 2025 may be the second best purchase year in American history for purchase transactions. And I'll show you that in the forecast data. And none of this is speculation because it's all based on just looking at the cohorts of demographically that are going to come into home buying years, the available supply, what's likely to be built, and all of those components that drive your market. So everything you do today, gang, right now, is building the foundation for the future. And I'm going to move on from the slide, but I just want to make one last point. I have a nice bio with a lot of pretty significant jobs towards the latter part of my career. I began my career as a loan officer. I was a loan rep in Denver, Colorado, became a top producer and started rising through management. And then my career took a different course. But all I will tell you is I'm the biggest cohort. In a respective way, I'm the biggest bars of the baby boom generation. I was born in 1957. I bought my first home in the early 1980s, as many of us did. But I want to emphasize to you, every one of those relationships that you make from these yellow bars, it isn't just one transaction. I've bought 14 homes in my life, 14. Second homes, couple of them, first homes. I have multiple primary residences. I've been relocated, and then my kids are buying homes now. I've referred them to my favorite loan officer who does all my stuff. I've used the same loan officer now for close to 20 years for every deal. I don't even shop rates because I just know he's going to get the job done. So that's the loyalty you are going to create from this incredible boom. So when I say you're on the front doorsteps of the biggest wave of home buyer demand in American history, that's not hyperbole. That's fact. It's data. And that's where you are. And no one else will get this chance going forward, as you see population statistics of younger people. And frankly, our population just isn't growing fast enough to ever create a wave like this, unless suddenly there's some huge burst in birthing, which I don't see in the future. So congratulations. It's just by pure luck, guys, that you happen to be in your career right now, sitting on the front doormat with a party about to happen, coming right at you here once the Fed is done. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about rates for a second. So I've shown you the demand side. What's going to happen here? So this is the history of the federal funds rate. It's from Fred. I often pull slides from Fred. Fred is the Federal Reserve of St. Louis. If you haven't used Fred, you should. It's free, and it's their research data depository. You can go in and get all sorts of great stuff. Just type in the history of the 30-year fixed rate loan, and you get that great spike in 1980 and what's happened since on both sides. All sorts of great data. You can get home sales data and national average median home price data and all sorts of great stuff. But this is just the history of the federal funds rate, the thing that Powell is tinkering with right now, going back to 1950, all right? So that's what this chart shows. 1950 is a long time. I was born in 57. So I'm 66. So that's a long history and time when we think about it. All of those gray vertical lines you see in this chart, those are recessions along the way. So we had 3, 6, 9, 10 recessions going back to 1955. Some of them were harder and more severe, like the Great Recession of 08, and that's more in your recent memory. Some of it were really short and quick, like the pandemic recession in 2020, which you see that skinny little line there. And whether we get a recession here or not, the same outcome is going to happen with Fed funds. So as you can see, every time the Fed goes through the process of tightening, often we have a recession at the peak of that tightening. You can see in most cases, there's a recession after they hit that peak. Not always. You can see in 1995, for example, when the Fed began tightening, we didn't have a recession. The economy had a soft landing, as it were, and the Fed slowed down and actually cut rates back a bit and then rose them again in the early 2000s. But all I want to emphasize to all of you is this. What happens after the Fed spikes on the peak and the economy begins to slow? The Fed then drops rates. It's happened every single time through all 10 of those recessions that you see here, and even in the other environments where they peaked and then they dropped. We are basically done with quantitative tightening. There might be a quarter point more, and right now the Fed is split about 50-50 on whether that's going to happen. And we have to see what the jobs data looks like this week and more. But in the end of the day, they'll make that decision in September. But as we think about what's happening here and looking at the history of rates, it's not guesswork to say the Fed's going to start lowering rates as the economy slows down. It's not guesswork because they've done it throughout history, through every decade here we have going back to the 1950s. And so that starts as a fundamental when people think, what's going to happen with interest rates going forward? This is a slide from Professor Zandi, his presentation that he just gave to the FDIC 2 days ago. You can see it's dated on the bottom right, August of 2023. And it's his view about what's going to happen with inflation and kind of what was going on with these various inflationary periods. But as you see the gray zone on the right, that's the final end of 2023 and into 2024. He sees inflation clearly heading back to that 2% target. And I want to remind you that Powell is not going to tighten till it gets to 2%. He said, if you listen to his Q&A in his hearing last week, when he announced the increase and then had the back and forth with the press, he made a statement that said, the Fed has no intention to tighten Fed funds and federal Fed policy until we get to 2%. He said that would be overshooting. In other words, because right now the inflation rate last month was 2.4. If we remain at that 2.4 rate or perhaps a little slower over the next few months, then it's highly improbable the Fed funds rate will increase. And so these are the things we need to look at. But either way, the economy is slowing. And that's a good thing. It's not going negative, as you see. The dotted horizontal line is at a little over 2%. And that's where, at least Professor Zandi believes, is where a healthy, balanced economy should be sitting. So that's one economist's view, but I wouldn't disaggregate his view from the other economists. This is a different set of economic data from Mike Fratantoni. Mike's the chief economist from the Mortgage Bankers Association. I hired Mike into that job. PhD from Johns Hopkins. He's an adjunct professor at Georgetown and GW in Washington, D.C., and used to be at the University of Washington in Washington State. The guy is one of the best economists in the nation. We were fortunate to get him at the MBA, but I love his data. So we're seeing a slowdown or disinflation, as it's being described here, across CPI, the Consumer Price Index, as well as goods and services. Why is this all important to show you? Because it's working, right? Stopping the inflation was the sole goal of the Fed, and all data says, guys, we're at the tail end of this thing. It's almost over because we are already slowing the economy pretty significantly. It's good. It's healthy. Dr. Zandi actually did an interview on CNBC this morning where he said he doesn't think we're going to have a recession. He thinks we're going to have a soft landing. There are others, particularly Fed governors, who think we're going to have a mild recession. It doesn't really matter to me either way. That's a technicality based on how many quarters have negative growth. But in the end of the day, we've accomplished everything we needed to accomplish with Fed tightening. And so why do I start here? Because it's simple. The common theme in economists forecasting right now says the moment the Fed is done with quantitative tightening, watch for an interest rate rally, particularly in mortgages and longer rates. The inverted 10-2 spread should reverse itself, and the absurdly high spread that the 30-year mortgage has over the 10-year treasury will resolve itself. In the same context, this data that says job market is expected to slow, this is really good. And the reason why I love this data is it's going to slow, but it's going to slow to the point where we begin growing again, just not at 600,000 jobs like we showed, 6 million jobs like we showed in 2021. This is going to slow to a more normalized level, still keeping the unemployment rate at near full employment. Just a very healthy economy overall. Yes, some will be hurt, as happens in any economic slowdown, but potential home buyer demand is not going to be changed at all because of all of this data. So a couple more things just about rates that make people think rates are going to come down. This is the 10-year minus the 2-year Treasury spread. Okay, so I pulled this again from Fred. It tracks it back to the 1970s, and all it does is it looks at what's the spread between the 10-year Treasury and the 2-year Treasury. In normalized markets, the 10-year should be a healthy spread above the 2-year, right? You're locking your money in for longer. You should get a higher return. But today it's inverted. As of today, this morning, it's inverted by 100 basis points, meaning that the 2-year is paying close to 5%, while the 10-year is paying close to 4%. And so that inverted yield curve is just a sign that the long end of the curve believes that rates are coming down. And so while short-term money may still be volatile based on all of this market volatility and Fed activity, the long end of the tail says that the expectation is for rates to decline. Another one that's looked at, this again is from Zandy, the previous one was from the MBA. This is a good one that looks at the 30-year versus the 10-year. I just showed you the 10 versus the 2, how it's inverted. This is 30-year mortgages over 10-year treasuries. That's a normal reference point that we've always used over the years to predict where rates should be, right? And normally, 30-year mortgages run between 1.5% and 2% over the 10-year. Well, right now they're 200 basis points, and they've been as high as 300 basis points over the 10-year if we look back over this last year. And so that spread tells you they should narrow. In other words, if you're 100 basis points high or even 50 basis points high on your spread on the 10-year to the 30-year, then that just tells you rates today would immediately drop by about 50 basis points, 75, maybe 100, immediately once the Fed normalized and markets returned to normal investing patterns. So all of that leads economists to give forecasts, right? Sorry, I tripped up the headline here when I clipped the artwork, but this is brand new, just released. It's MBA, their freshest forecast. And I want to just give you the conclusions that are based somewhat on the data I just presented to you and a whole lot more. So the first is looking at Fed funds rate. Obviously, 5 1/8 is where we're at right now. And then I'm just going to tell you that 5 1/8 is going to be the average for 2023. That's what they're showing is average rates. But then 2024, an expectation of 3 1/8, and 2025, an expectation of 2 3/8. So that means that what Dr. Frattantoni believes is we are going to go into a much slower economy, and the Fed's going to now use stimulus to make sure we don't go below 2 because we're going to get too close to 2. And remember, I think the Fed is more concerned with being under 2% than over 2%. In terms of incremental change. And that's why most economists are saying the Fed's going to have to start lowering rates next year to make sure the economy doesn't dip into a harder recession. And then if you look at the corresponding forecast for rates, the 10-year averaging 3.3 this year, dropping to 2.9 next year and 2.8 the following year, more normalized path. And then with 30-year mortgages, averaging this year at 5.8, I'll talk about that in a minute. Going into the 4s next year solidly, the high 4s and then the mid 4s out to 2025. And the reason why Frattantoni and a whole bunch of other economists feel the same way about this year is most economists feel that mortgage rates are going to come down at least in Q4 of this year, once the Fed is done. And we'll know that with greater certainty following the September meeting, which takes place in Jackson Hole. So these are the important variables to consider. But again, this isn't some hyperbole in USA Today or Diana Olick on CNBC who doesn't have a master's in business, let alone a PhD. This is actually coming from people who have studied this and have been more right than they've been wrong over decades. So just to put an exclamation point on that, this is from Forbes Advisor. It came out in June of 2023, so it's relatively new. And I'm just going to highlight a whole bunch of different economists all saying relatively the same thing. They may think that it'll start at a different level. They may say the rate at the end of the year may be slightly different, but they're all saying the same thing. The top one is Robert Frick. He's the chief economist at Navy Fed. Be prepared to jump on a dip in rates. So Frick, by the way, is a great economist, and he worked at several federal agencies over his career as a chief economist there as well. Sam Cater at Freddie Mac, their chief economist, rates should gently decline over the course of 2023. Remember, he said this in June, so he's expecting the remainder of the year to look like that. NAR's economist, mortgage rates will drop. He says the 30-year will drop, falling to 6 this year and into 5.6 next year. He's one of the most conservative, by the way. But I guess when you're at 7, 6 looks a lot better. Odetta Kushi. Odetta is brilliant. If you get any of the First American data sent to you every month, you read Odetta's stuff. I think it's reasonable to assume that rates will come down a bit second half of the year. Matt Vernon, who's the head of retail lending for Bank of America, not mortgage lending, that's all retail lending for the bank. But nevertheless, this is from his global research team. Bank of America Global Research expects mortgage rates to fall to 5.25% by year end. Mortgage Bankers Association, Mike Frantoni, our forecast is for mortgage rates to be closer to 5.5% by year end and then drop a little lower next year. Stephen Rinaldi, I don't know if you know the Rinaldi group, but they're really good. Rates will begin to slide into the summer, beginning a slow but relatively steady lowering of interest rates. This was run as an article in Forbes. It's not just one or two economists in various sectors. It's pretty much universal across the board. Now, why are they all saying this? Because they see the same data we just showed you. They know where the demand's going to be. They know the inverted yield curves. They know what's going to happen with the Fed's moves and what always happens after the Fed's done with tightening in terms of interest rate rallies. And all of this is part of what's built into their predictions. Okay? So I want to round the corner a little bit. We've talked about how you sitting on the front doorsteps of the biggest generational demand for home ownership that's ever occurred in the history of this country. Shown you a whole lot of data as to why the logic of market makers says rates are going to come down. You could argue as to exact amount at the end of the year. I think a lot of it has to do with what happens in Jackson Hole. But nevertheless, they're going to come down definitely more so into next year across the board. And multiple economists saying the same thing. So we've got the supply features figured out. We've got the rate stuff figured out in a relative sense. So let's talk about home prices. So I scratch my head. Honestly, guys, I scratch my head for realtor partners, your realtor partners, because I wonder when their clients tell them, I want to sit on the sidelines and just see what happens. I just don't think they understand the fundamentals. CoreLogic just released today that average home price appreciation in the United States year-to-date 2023 is 4.4% up. So that means your $300,000 home is $12,000 more on average. Granted, not all markets are the same. Some are stronger than others. But this is from Fred. This is the median sales price of all homes sold in the United States. This isn't going back just a decade or two. This is going back to 1960. I was 3 years old when this data chart started. And again, in this case, we go through 8 recessions, since 1960. And yeah, there are pockets where home values have declined, but it doesn't matter. In fact, the best time to buy is in the peak of when the Fed or somebody is tinkering with your economy to create lower demand. Because that's what the Fed's doing, right? The Fed's trying to say, we got to slow down housing. And so they've done the best that they can trying to slow down that demand. They haven't killed it, but we don't have the 18% year over year home price appreciation like we had in 20 and 21. We have 4%, which is a very healthy home price appreciation rate. But nevertheless, this chart says one thing: buy a home, get in now, hold on to that home, because home prices only go up over time. Period. End of story. It's inarguable, because this is the data of median home prices in the United States across the entire country from the Federal Reserve itself. And so if I'm going to think about tools, like when you get this deck, the actual physical copy of it, and you start thinking about what do I want to piece together to tell a story to my real estate agents, one, to make them feel better because they're bummed, they're freaking out, they're worried about what's going to happen in the market because they're not getting good inputs. And two, they want tools. They want tools to go tell their potential home buyers why they should buy now. And you're getting some of those tools in this presentation. They also want tools to tell sellers why they should come to market. And I'll walk you through that in just a moment. But in the end of the day, this data says home prices only go up. Now, will that happen going forward? Gosh, I wonder. Let's see if it's going to happen going forward. So this is from Mark Zandi, that chief economist at Moody's Analytics. Moody's, the biggest ratings agency in the world. This is the month's supply of homes available for sale in the United States as we sit today. We have about 2.9, 3 months of supply of homes for sale in this country, all right? We haven't seen supply this low in the history of this line, other than in 2021 when it got super hot there for home purchases. But going back prior to the gold rush that Powell started in March of 2020, we don't see this any lower than this in terms of supply. Remember the core fundamentals of economics: supply and demand. And unfortunately, the nation has too much demand for too little supply. So then you ask, well, what's driving this? Aren't we going to build more homes? Well, the problem is we're not. So we're improving. Single family home starts for new construction is improving. But I just want to show you this chart. This chart that takes you back to 1939 and earlier. This is all housing stock of units by year built and building type. So in other words, it's all new construction. The dark blue portions of each line are single family detached. The orange units are 1 unit attached. Those are condos. Then we have 2 to 4s in gray, 5 to 20s in yellow, and 20 plus units in blue, and then green is manufactured housing, okay? That's all the units being constructed in the United States for anybody to live in, whether they rent or own. Look at what we're seeing currently on the far right of the scale. Normally, we build somewhere between 16 to 18 million homes per year. This year, we'll be lucky to build 4 million. We're not building supply to match the demand. I'll give you just one slight tangent. The Congressional Budget Office, I don't have this in my presentation. I used it for a meeting with my board that I sit on. But the Congressional Budget Office just released a population forecast for the next 30 years. Excuse me, for the next 30 years, yeah. And the population is expected to grow by about 50 million Americans over the next 30 years. Now, that growth rate is slower than what we've experienced over the last few decades, but it's still growth, right? So we're making more Americans, because a slow growth rate over a population of 330 million Americans, it still means more people than a fast growth rate over a population of 280 million Americans. So all of this story says supply is not good. And that is a great story for putting a natural floor to home prices. But this will resolve itself. And, And I want to just have you guys pay attention to the home seller stock for a moment. I didn't show this slide for lack of time, and we can certainly do it during Q&A. But there's a slide looking at migration data and where people are moving to and where they're buying homes. And what we're finding is if they're buying homes if they're moving within the same county, the volume of activity moving within the same county has plummeted by 73% over what it normally does. And the only places we're seeing increases in resale housing stock is for people moving out of state to other less expensive markets or to retirement markets. And so the reason why we believe that obviously existing housing stock, people aren't coming to market with their homes for sale yet, is they don't want to sell their home and buy a new home with a 7% interest rate. They got their 3% rate. They don't want to go from 3 to 7. I think the way you motivate them is to say, look, if you do it now, you're going to beat everybody else who's going to come to market, because I promise you, when rates go down to the fives and maybe the 4s next year, everybody's going to come out of the woodwork because we have so much pent up desire to sell, given that we've had such a slowdown of resale transactions over these last 2 years. And so the volume will increase, probably will shift more to a buyer's market than from the seller's market it is today. So if I'm a seller and I want to get the highest price possible on my home, my argument is you should come to market now or do it in the fall market, because it's only going to get more competitive next year as pent-up desire to sell from everybody frustrated who wants to finally get out of that house. The young couple who had a baby during COVID, they need that extra bedroom. They've waited this long because they have a 3% rate, but they can't wait any longer. They're going to make that move once rates get within range to say, yep, that's low enough, I'm going to make that move. Or the baby boomer who wants to retire, wants to move to that retirement community, that 55 plus community or whatever it is, who's waited, they'll make that move too. And so we're going to see a significant influx in resale transactions, even though home building is going to take longer to catch up. But the argument for sellers is, don't worry about the rate. Rent the rate, maximize the capacity, the sales price of your home, and put it on the market. I think both of these arguments can work if you put it together well and internalize it for a presentation at a real estate office or one-on-one meeting with a real estate agent. I'm showing you the same slide I showed you earlier. I'm just showing it to you because it's from a different economist. And this is from a presentation that was done at the Fed. It was a group of economists that came in and gave this presentation about a month and a half ago. And it's the same data, right? Median age for first-time home buyers, as you see, age 34. Irrefutable, it's a data point, so everybody fortunately uses the same number. And then they look at past first-time home buyers and up-and-coming new buyers. This is in 3-year cohorts, right? So it's 3 years in each bar, 33 to 35. The blue bar is 30 to 32, 27 to 29, 24 to 26. Hell, even the 21 to 23-year-old is bigger than the current cohort in their peak home buying year. So again, nobody denies what this title of this slide says. Coming soon, gang, an even bigger wave of potential home buyers. It's not just your opportunity that you sit on the front doorsteps of the biggest wave of home buyer demand the nation has ever seen. It's that I really believe we have an obligation, all of us who are loan officers, to go work with our referral partners to get our potential buyers who are already our prospects as realtors into the home purchase transaction if they can afford the home, because it's only going to get more expensive and they're going to be competing with even more demand as we move forward over the year ahead. So I just think it's a pretty amazing environment that you guys sit in today. Another one, I want to just end with this before I close, but I like this one. This is from Mike Frantoni. He just gave this presentation at MBA's most recent conference. I think it was their tech conference. And what did he do? He showed the same demographics. This is 2021 estimates, so it's not 2020 like the early one did. And it shows, his point is, there are 50 million Americans between ages 28 to 38, right? That's when all the first-time home purchase activity really heats up. And he shows it on the right. So this slide on this part, the right side of the slide is what is most important. It shows home ownership rate by age. The gray line, with home ownership rates around 40% on average, going back for the last 2 decades, is Americans under age 35. When you move one cohort up, age 35 to 44, that's when everything busts loose, right? The homeownership rate jumps to 62 and then just continues to rise as people get older. The point here is it isn't just a mild impact when people get into their 30s. The homeownership demand when people get into their 30s is massive. It's enormous. It's ginormous, as a good friend of mine always says. And that's something that you guys are literally going to be living. Your real estate agents are going to be living it. Your home builders are going to be living it. And the question is, who's going to be smart enough to get in and help their home buyers take advantage of this now before the waves become overwhelming? I'm sorry, I said it's my last slide. This is my last slide. So this is a forecast just published. It's the August forecast. And I just want to highlight a few things from the Mortgage Bankers Association. I know it's fine print. As this is being recorded, and I'm also going to send the deck that'll be available to all of you. If you look at total existing home sales forecast in units, we're looking at 5 million homes that were sold last year. We're only looking at about 4.3 million existing homes this year. We think that number is explicitly depressed because of the rate differential, which is going to resolve itself as rates go down, which leads to the forecast of 2024 going to 4.6 and then 2025 surpassing last year in terms of units, home sales units. And then likewise for new homes being built, as I said, it's going to be hard to build enough homes, but they're catching up, right? We have 676,000 new homes expected to be sold this year, up to 766,000, roughly 100,000 more homes 2 years from now. So really good positive information. And that correlates down, if you look at mortgage origination volume forecasts, look at the underlined area, look at 2025, an expectation of $1.8 trillion in mortgage volume. That would make this one of the largest years in mortgage volume in American history. I'm sorry, this is the last year. So I put this into a chart version. Look at the far right, 2025. This is total mortgage volume going back to 2002. But if you look at 2025 on the far right, a $1.78 trillion expected mortgage year, that would be second only to 2021, which was the biggest year in American history. 2025, by this forecast, says this will be the second biggest purchase year in American history. And by the way, the pathway there, you're going to have a few more refis next year and more purchases. So while the overall forecast this year is for $1.8 trillion, it's expected to go to $2.1 trillion in total mortgage volume next year and up to $2.5 trillion the following year. We'll never go back to 2020 and 2021. But if you're in the purchase market, if that's your expertise as a traditional retail lender and you're working your tail end off to build those relationships and establish your business for when the Fed is done, rates start dropping, and everybody gets excited again, you are really going to have a very stable, steady ride. And remember, we won't be done right-sizing until we get through this, what's going to be a hard winter, and through the end of the first quarter. You watch, the competition will be less, there'll be fewer companies, fewer loan officers to compete with, and margins will begin to return to more normalized levels. Last thing, guys, as you look at the slide, many of you got into the business back in post-2009. That's when the majority of loan officers in this country got into the business. All those years were, in a relative sense, slower than what we're going to see over the next couple of years. On average, they were slower. And yet we made pretty good margin in 2012, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. We had good margins. We had good incomes. It all blew up with the COVID pandemic and then the Fed actions in March of 2020. And then that created all the corresponding response from the Fed to slow down the economy. This has been a very weird technical environment since 2020. But when this market returns over the next couple of years, you're going to have better years than you had in all those years going back to the early 2000s. And likewise, you'll have margins that were back in those ranges, which will be very positive. I'm telling you guys, everything you do right now is building for the future. So let me just end with these points. One, don't let short-term emotions invade facts and fundamentals. All I showed you here were facts and fundamentals. I may have told my own story about those facts and fundamentals, about what I think they mean. You need to grab hold of which ones you want to use and how you want to articulate them, and go out and make a bunch of sales calls. These are tools to go charge the mountain with. It's not going out and quoting your next rate. In fact, I argue with everybody, don't quote rates. Don't sell stuff. Sell ideas. These are ideas. This is what will change your success pattern against your competition. 2, rates are going to respond to a slowing economy. Everybody knows it. They always have historically, and they are expected to going forward, and that's why the forecasts all say that, and all those economists say that, yes, they will respond. 3rd, unfortunately, the supply issues will remain. It won't be evenly distributed. Some markets will have ample supply. Others will be multiple listings and multiple offers and tight supply. But overall, we're going to have supply challenges in this country. 4, you are on the front doorsteps of the biggest wave of demand in American history, and that remains. I showed you 3 different economist slides that were given at quant geek presentations inside the Beltway. They weren't given to salespeople who were mortgage originators to make them feel good. They were given to talk about what's going to offset the economy, some of the offsets that will help keep the economy stable and growing. And that's a big one. And you're sitting at the front doorstep, as are all your realtor partners. The forecast it shows increase in sales with lower interest rates. You can't ask for more than that. And finally, the industry is not finished right sizing. Self-selection continues. Self-selection meaning companies are selling themselves because they've been losing money progressively for too many quarters. So many are up for sale. And many loan officers, I promise you, through this winter, it's going to get tough. Just be prepared for it. Purchase market is a cyclical market. So it's going to be a tough winter, maybe not as tough as last winter if rates come down, because we can do some refis. But nevertheless, there will be a lot of loan officers that finally say, man, I'm throwing in the towel. That's all I can take. Because they didn't know how to work in a normal purchase market. They got lazy during 2020 and 2021. And if you're not that person, you'll be the winner. And then finally, everything you do today is building your business for tomorrow. And so I'm going to stop there with the video and go back to the screen. So Jim, I'll send you the deck afterwards. I think there's a great opportunity for all your partners in the TPO world here to take this stuff and personalize it. Don't do my deck the way I put it together.
Right.
I take data, it works for me. I redo my decks all over the place. I just did a big presentation for a guy named Craig Northrup. If you work in Maryland, you know who Craig is, and his whole team. He's the #1 producer for Long and Foster and one of the top teams in America. And he's an old friend. So I did a presentation for him for his sales team. I showed him 4 slides, just 4 slides, because realtors can't consume all that interest rate garbage. It'll make them crazy. They don't understand it. So you got to pick out what's going to work for your audience. And that's the key.
Yeah, and that's the key to the success of any individual loan officer. Know your audience, know your realtors. You spend more time with them than you probably care to admit. Customize this, make it your own, and hit right to the bullseye. Don't give them a bunch of fluff. Stick to the stuff they care about.
Yeah. Hey, Jim, can you answer one question? Because people all want this deck. I'm going to send it to you. Are you going to automatically send it to them, or what's the process?
So we have everyone who RSVP'd registered. We will get this to everyone who's on the call within 24 hours. We might tighten up, clean up some of the video stuff, but we'll get it all out in short order to everyone who's on the call. And we will also post this on UHM Go. So for our TPO partners, we'll make it available 2 ways. We'll send it out via email from the group, and then we'll make it available on our website for a couple days. So if people need it, they can easily access it at their leisure. And then when you look at some great Q&A that have come through while you were presenting, I just want to start with, when you look at the chart you put together at the end about origination volume, it'd be really nice to see that historical data in units, because when you see that volume going up over a long period of time, sales price has gone up, mortgage amount. When I look at what's going on in 2023, this has been a pretty rough year in some respects, but I always try to look at it in units, not just dollars, and try to look back over my career and say, what is this really like?
Yeah, and I'll tell you that the slide I used, this one, no, that's not it. The slide I used here. I won't bore you with it, but oh, here it is. This slide, it did show units, right? So the housing measures above at the very top of the page, I had red lines on them. It's in my presentation. Those were units of homes, so single family. Now it only goes to last year, so I understand you'd love to see previous years. You could get that data. You're right, though. But it does show that units are going to increase. Both, by the way, don't look at housing starts, look at home sales.
Right.
There's two sections there. So look at home sales. Those are in units, not dollars. And it'll show total existing home sales and new homes being sold. And then down below, I showed you mortgage volume. And the reason why I did do both there is you're right. It does show that home sales volume is going to increase. But last I checked for loan officers who are on this call, you get paid by the dollar amount, not the loan account. So for you, yes, you're going to benefit overall by more units being sold at higher prices, meaning higher average loan balances. And all of that is going to feed into your success. But in a relative sense, it's going to be a really good housing market. We're still going to have a shortage of units going forward, and it won't resolve all of the real estate agent concerns. One of the problems in the real estate industry, by the way, and I ran a huge real estate company. I ran Long and Foster Real Estate, had 14,000 agents in my company at one point. We have so many more new agents who have come into the business in the last 4 years, a lot driven by the 2020-21 environment, where they thought it would be easy money and a good career to have. They hit the same wall everybody else did in 2022 and currently, but I believe that the real estate industry is oversupplied, as it were. So at the end of the day, that's just going to be one of the realities. So I think all industries ultimately do right size. If people can't make a living, they may keep the license and hang it in a real estate office, but they're not going to be working that hard. So we'll see.
One of the other questions on the topic of where it's going, there's a big demand for new home starts. Where will the new home starts come from? Where is that increase in activity? Do you see any bright spots in that?
Yeah, there's a lot of data on that. I'm not going to go pull up another slide. My computer's filled with nothing but data slides. But yeah, it's going to be where the peak demand areas are. I don't know if we're going to see a shift away from areas in California, for example. You know, insurance companies are sure shying away from certain parts of California. Mm-hmm. We'll see. And the tax structure and costs of land and home values are certainly causing some migration out of the state of California. We're certainly have seen growth in places like Florida and less expensive markets. I can show you that that's for another time. But we are seeing migration to less affordable markets. Back in the day when I worked for the president and was on the housing team, we were talking about how to get the economy fixed. We used to break up the economy and talk about it in terms of sand states and brown states. Sand states were basically Arizona, Las Vegas, all the shorefront in the southeast, Alabama along the southern shore, and then California. Those were the sand state areas where people go to buy second homes or retire. And the brown states were manufacturing states, were areas where people still get jobs and work in this country. There's a lot of shifting going on, right? Because you need people, manufacturers need people working in their factory and in their plants. You can't, if you're going to build cars in Detroit, you need people in Detroit to actually do the work. But AI and remote working can change a lot of where people live. So it'll be interesting to watch how that migration happens over the next several years.
One of the other questions, are you able to speak to the health of the warehouse line providers? We've heard a lot with some of the regional banks. There's been some shifts, changes in that space. Where do you see in the short term the warehouse bank sector of finance going?
Well, the challenge that we have for all of you is, and I'm certain that Union Home could talk about this because they have warehouse banks as well, is just never put all your eggs in one basket, because a disruption can occur And if a bank fails, it can create ripples effects across the marketplace. We've seen some folks exit the warehouse space, actually some pretty well-known players that surprised me. And if the new capital rule goes into effect, I don't know if you're aware of this, but the OCC, 3 federal regulators are put out for notice and comment just a few days ago, a new capital rule for big banks, which would explicitly hurt capital being used in the mortgage finance space. And it may change how warehouse lenders, how banks want to operate or operate at all their warehouse facilities. So there'll always be liquidity, and it's just a matter of where it comes from. But for right now, you need to have multiple sources for your warehouse lines, just in case, even if it means maybe paying a non-use fee from time to time.
Yeah, never want all your eggs in one basket in that regard, for sure. One of the other questions we have is, Dave, can you comment on the impact on rates with the LLPAs that were temporarily instituted in 08-09 that still exist today, and the conversation as of late around changes with LLPAs, and especially the issue around the 43?
Yeah, I was very vocal on this, as Jim knows, and others. I wrote several articles about it. I was on Fox News, CNBC. I was interviewed by Newsweek and the New York Post and others, and it created a real uproar inside the Beltway because many in the Biden administration, including Sandra Thompson, who runs the FHFA, was not pleased that a former Obamaite, and who they assumed was a Democrat regardless, would attack a policy of theirs. But in the end of the day, housing is not political, and they're making it political. So I believe these LLPA changes were wrong. I don't think that's the right way to get there. If you want to come up with a subsidy program, there's a lot of explicit ways the GSEs have done so in the past, and they could do so again. But all of you who are lenders, you know that the cells of the LLPA grid that got improved still left FHA as better execution for the vast majority of those loans, because the cell improvements were for lower FICOs at the maximum LTVs. And frankly, if you're below a 720 FICO at a 95 or above LTV, your cheaper loan is an FHA if you can get it. So it's just interesting how, in most cases, so it just reflected a lack of understanding. And the 43 DTI was just an incredible lack of foresight, and reflected that on a misunderstanding of how our business works. And it would have caused huge damage for all of you. Like, you take an application, you calculate the ratios at time of app, you say, this is your rate, you should be good, goes to underwriting. They calculate it slightly differently because they're self-employed, which is the biggest challenge right now in your underwriting process. The DTI goes to 44. Something you got to call the borrower back and say, good news, we got you approved. Bad news, I got to raise your rate. That stuff would not sit well with the consumer complaint database at the CFPB. So they just made a really dumb decision on the DTI. They backed off the DTI. They backed off the DTI.
Broadly, you covered it in every market media when that came out. That article you put out and your follow up, it reached a lot of people. And then when you talk to like the average consumer that heard that stuff, like, really, my rate can change multiple times? Like, yeah. Like, the common sense and logic was so hard for the average consumer to digest.
Yeah. Absolutely.
We have one series of questions left, one topic, so I'll just wrap it up. There's a lot about what do you see going on over the next 6 months in the merger and acquisition arena. We've heard in the industry that people are coming and going, but what do you think happens over the next 6 months?
Well, I'm indirectly working in the space, and I will just tell you that the M&A market is fast and furious right now. And there's a whole ton of particularly non-bank originators that have yet figured out how to churn a profit, even on a run rate basis. They're obviously going to all lose money for the year, and they're looking to sell. And I know folks like Bill Cosgrove, who owns Union Home, wants to keep growing. And so you have these growth-oriented institutions, and then you have a lot of mostly smaller independents that would like to sell and get out. And so that's just really incredibly active right now. Through one of my clients, I'm very active in that space. And it's interesting how these deals work. They're mostly on earnouts, meaning you're not going to get a big payout when you sell, but if you can become productive in your new world, if that entity can, the seller, the owner of that company that sells, can stand to get paid off a few years down the road. But it is fast and furious, and there's a lot of companies that if they don't sell, they're not going to survive, because if they're losing money now, especially in June and July, August, we'll see what happens, and then it's going to become a slow winter, right? I hate this to scare you guys, but winter, I believe, is going to be rough. It's going to be the last gasps of pain, and through the early part of the first quarter next year, and that's when the final washout will come, because there's just going to be a lot of people who just cannot make it through that cycle. And that's why we're seeing so much merger and acquisition activity right now of people wanting to sell, because they want to get it done before this winter arrives. So we'll see where it ends up. Mike Tony and the team at DDA think that the whole industry needs to downsize by about another 15%. So that's a significant amount.
It's common. And for all of us, if you're going through some kind of merger, and if your company's been struggling to be profitable, cash flow is a concern, and then you get acquired by someone in growth mode, it creates more opportunities from everyone in that space. There's always going to be some casualties, but a little bit of purging is not the end of the world. And a common conversation we have with our group is more food is not coming to the table. We just need less people showing up to eat. So with that, Dave, thanks again for doing this twice. We really appreciate it. Very insightful.
Anytime, Jim.
We'll get the data out quickly for our Union Home third-party origination partners. Thank you very much for making the time this afternoon, and we will make this available to our account executives, to this group who participated, and on UHM Go all in the next 24 hours.